You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.
It's such a delight to think about Ben Franklin's World for this 400th episode. And first of all, I have to say congratulations. It's quite an achievement to make it to this milestone.
Hello, and welcome to episode 400 of Ben Franklin's World, the podcast dedicated to helping you learn more about how the people and events of our early American past have shaped the present-day world we live in. And I'm your host, Liz Covart. I feel like this one snuck up on us, but here we are at episode 400. Wow, that's a lot of episodes in our back catalog. And I have to say that most of the episodes over the years, even if they're 10 years old, they stand up pretty well. Not only is the history relevant, but even the audio stands up pretty well, so I'm pretty pleased with that. Now, to mark our achievement, we're celebrating with an episode inspired by you. Earlier this year, when I asked you the question for how you wanted to mark episode 400, you suggested that we ask a lot of different historians about their ideas on a lot of different topics. So I kind of mashed your suggestions together and Frankensteined them and came up with two questions to pose a lot of different historians. The two questions we're posing are, what does Ben Franklin's world, and that's world with a lowercase w, what does Ben Franklin's world mean to you, and how do you define this world? And what historical event, person, or place do you wish more people knew about in the era of Ben Franklin? From there, I invited many of our previous guests to participate in this episode by answering our questions. Now, what's really fun about this episode is that none of our guest historians knew who would be participating, and they didn't know what their colleagues were going to say in answer to our questions. So I think you're going to find it really fascinating to hear the differences and similarities in all of their different answers. I also think you're going to love the everyday people that our different guests highlighted because they'd really like for us to know more about them. Now, before we dive into this fascinating episode, I'd like to take a moment to thank you. Thank you for listening and for your desire to know more about early American history. I love this period, especially the American Revolutionary era. That's my jam. And it's always such a joy to get behind this mic and create new episodes for you. Because in each episode, we get to learn something new about early America, and we get to meet the historians who do the painstaking work to help us know more about how past peoples lived, how past events took place, and generally, how past societies functioned and informed our present-day world. Thank you so much for sharing your time with me and for your insatiable curiosity. You have suggested so many different topics over the years, and I know we haven't covered all of them yet, but we're working towards it. So here's to you. Congratulations on episode 400. And with that, here's what our guest scholars had to say about what Ben Franklin's world means to them, how they define it, and what and who they wished you knew more about.
Hi, I'm Adrienne Chastain-Weimer, a professor of history at Providence College in Rhode Island. I've authored most recently A Constitutional Culture, New England and the Struggle Against Arbitrary Rule in the Restoration Empire. I'm so happy to celebrate the 400th episode of Ben Franklin's World and the incredible work that goes into this podcast. To me, Ben Franklin's World is early America in a very broad sense, a fascinating place where people were figuring out fundamental questions about survival, about cross-cultural diplomacy, about constitutionalism, and about human rights. The person I wish more people knew about is Job Katanánet. He was a Nipmuc teaching pastor at Magankog. He could preach fluently in two languages. He had mastered both indigenous and English carpentry skills, and he escaped captivity twice.
I'm Philip Reed. I'm an independent scholar, and I'm the author of The Merchant Ship in the British Atlantic and a Boston Schooner in the Royal Navy. For me, Ben Franklin's world means the Anglo-American Atlantic world, when both British America and Britain itself faced the Atlantic Ocean, not just literally, but in their basic conceptions of their own geography. The ocean separated the two, but it also connected them. It was a volatile and violent world, mixing together Europeans, Africans, and indigenous Americans, whether they liked it or not, and forcing them to try to live and to live with each other. There were remarkable successes and abject failures. My work highlights the importance of the use of the ocean and the technology people use to travel on it and to exploit its resources. The centrality of the Atlantic itself to this world is what I emphasize.
My name is Catherine O'Donnell, and I'm from Arizona State University. Ben Franklin's world for me is a kind of dream. It's the dream of welcoming people into a way of thinking about history that gets us closer to the endless connectedness of the past, the chains of causality and relationships that link it all together and link it all to us. So that's the first part of the dream. And the second part is that unknowability and tangled nature would make people happy rather than impatient. This isn't scholars being opaque or difficult. It's scholars being humbled, being astonished. People are welcome to enter this world any way they'd like, and they'll find it's all one story, and it's a story we can never tell, which means we get to keep talking and reading together. So it's vast, but it's kind of cozy. And who do I wish people knew more about? I kept thinking about different people, and this morning I've been thinking about Joseph Plum Martin. So Joseph Plum Martin it is. I would like more people to know of him because when people know of him, they tend to want to know about him. Ordinary Courage, the title affixed to his memoir, might have pleased Martin. It's a good title, but Martin knew he wasn't ordinary. He knew, and his memoir reminds us that ordinary, that word, is a fiction we've made up to blunt the strangeness of the fact that the world is made up of people we can't know, but who are as real as we are. War is interesting to people, so he draws people in. And his words draw people into thinking about soldiering both as a cause and as a job, and for the most part, a terrible job. Learning about Martin as learning about big things like the Pension Act of 1818, and long before that, the Articles of Confederation. It's also learning about how one man can seethe with resentment for his country and also desperately want its love. Martin is funny and sly and angry, and he's proud of his writing, even as he disavows all education. So I would just say, here's to Joseph Plum Martin and his world, and to Ben Franklin's world, and to its 400th episode.
Thank you, Catherine. Next, we're going to hear from three scholars. The first is David Schmidt, who you might remember from episode 327, when we spoke with David about Ken Burns' documentary, Benjamin Franklin, which, if you haven't seen it yet, you can still watch it on PBS. David was a senior producer on that documentary, and presently, he's working as a senior producer on Ken Burns' forthcoming 6-part film series, The American Revolution. So David is someone who's really well steeped in Ben Franklin's world. The second scholar is Morgan McCullough, a recent PhD graduate from William & Mary, where she developed a research expertise in early American women's history and material culture, those everyday objects from early America. I'm really excited for you to hear from Morgan because she's the scholar who transcribes our episodes and copy edits and fact checks our transcripts. Morgan is a really fantastic editor, and she aspires to work in book publishing. So if you're a book editor, please be in touch because I'd love to introduce you to Morgan. And the third scholar that you'll hear from is our friend Colin Calloway. Colin has appeared in several episodes of Ben Franklin's World, and he's an award-winning historian and professor of history at Dartmouth College who is really well known for his work in Native American history.
My name is David Schmidt. I don't know there are limits to Benjamin Franklin's world. His vision looked forward and backward, skyward, seaward, and the world over. But if I had to give Ben Franklin's world boundaries, I suppose I would suggest the Atlantic Ocean and its watershed through the entirety of the 18th century. I wish people today, myself included, could know more about the people whose names are lost to history. That we know as much as we know is a testament to the power of the written language, but literacy was kept from so many. Of people whose names we do know, I wish people today could know more about advocates for change who shared the earth with Benjamin Franklin. People like Absalom Jones and Benjamin Lay, Phyllis Wheatley, and Samson Occom. I sometimes feel there's a tendency among the living to think themselves better than those who went before. We are not. It's just that it's our turn now, and the stories of those who struggled in their time can remind us to do good work in our own.
I'm Morgan McCullough, and I transcribe Ben Franklin's World. I think Ben Franklin's World, for me, is this period around the Atlantic from the late 15th to the early 19th century. And what that world has meant to me is it's been this history that's been constantly surprising me. I remember learning in undergrad that Black men and white women voted in New Jersey in the late 18th century, and that's not what I expected. And even when this history is really hard, there's disease in indigenous communities and slavery and colonialism. There's also these stories of people and communities who persisted and who challenged those norms. And it's really an honor to continue to learn their stories and to learn that past, who I wish people knew more about. So there's this Chickasaw woman, and we don't know her name, but she was married to this guy named James Adair, and he was a British colonist and a trader in the Southeast and Indian country. And eventually he writes this book about Native people. And that book, a lot of historians use it today to write about those communities. And at one moment in the book, he says, "My wife corrected me. She said, don't get that wrong." And so he corrects it. And you have to think that throughout that whole book that he wrote, she was probably doing that a lot. And she was probably doing a lot of translation for James, both literal and cultural. And I think that his book wouldn't have existed or been possible without her. And there's a lot of Indigenous women like her who we don't know a lot about them in the sources that exist today, but they were definitely there.
Having written a book on the Indian world of George Washington, it's not surprising that I think of Franklin's world as one that sits between Europe, across the Atlantic, and Indian country, if you like, across the Appalachians. It's exemplified by Franklin himself, who, in the middle of the century, printed a whole string of Indian treaties, and who expected and intended to sell those treaties in England. I also think that perhaps the event that I want more people to know about of this world is the Treaty of Fort Pitt in 1778. Franklin, of course, famously was involved in engineering the Treaty of Alliance with France in that year, and people don't usually think of the Treaty of Fort Pitt as another step in the United States taking its place among the powers of the earth. If you look at that treaty, it's a very short treaty, but it contains a phrase, a clause, in which the new United States holds out the promise to the Delaware Nation that once independence is secured, the Delaware Nation may lead an Indian state with representation in Congress. We can dispute and think what we want about the United States' intentions in that, but it leaves lots of questions to think about the enduring presence and power of Native peoples in this world. Colin Calloway.
This is Kate Carté. I'm a professor of history at Southern Methodist University. What does Ben Franklin's world mean to me? It means the splendid and glorious and dirty and chaotic cities of Philadelphia and Boston and London and Paris in the 18th century. It represents the best of what the 18th century had to offer in terms of its intellectual sophistication and its cosmopolitanism. And yet, when I think of Ben Franklin's world, I can't help but think about his politicking and his engagement in the seedier and less pleasant sides of the 18th century. So his willingness to fight wars against Indigenous Americans, his evolution over time, but willingness to engage in slavery. Ben Franklin brings those different aspects of the 18th century together into one world. And for me, that's what the 18th century really is. It's the time and place where we see the best and the worst of humanity right next to each other in deep and engaged conversation, in self-conscious conversation. If there's one place I can think of that I would wish people knew more about from that era, what comes to mind is the picture of a tavern on the side of a road in backcountry Pennsylvania or North Carolina, and thinking of all the people that would have passed through that tavern: Indigenous people, enslaved people, poor travelers, rich travelers, farmers on the way to market, farmers going to plead debt cases, wealthy speculators going to seek out big pieces of land they could buy. I know a lot of historians have written about alcohol and taverns as places where people come together, where political assessments were made, where people tried to gauge political opinion, where newspapers were read. If I could give one thing to our students or to public audiences who are interested in the 18th century, I would give them a bird's eye view into that tavern and have them hear all the conversations and see all the people who walked through in their diversity, in the ways they treated each other with respect, got out of each other's way when somebody needed a seat, when someone spilled a drink, and also the ways they disregarded one another, knocked each other over, were rude to one another, the ways they spat on the floor and straightened their waistcoats at the same time.
My name is Terrence Rucker, and I'm a senior historical publication specialist in the Office of the Historian for the U.S. House of Representatives. When I think of Ben Franklin's world, it reminds me of the Transformers because there's more to it than meets the eye. I knew about a few topics within colonial America and the early Republic, but the Ben Franklin's World podcast enabled me to see the United States as one part of the Americas. I also learned so much cutting-edge scholarship about slavery in the Americas, especially in the West. As a student of the Continental Congress, the Doing History series, episodes 151 through 166, enhanced my understanding about the origins of the United States Congress and its institutional development. One subject that I focus on is Congress's role in the territorial expansion of the United States. Consequently, I look at the use of the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 over time. Some of the effects of the ordinance can be seen with the passage of the Southwest Ordinance in 1790, public land distribution in the Trans-Mississippi West, and the impact of the Mexican Cession in the late 1840s. Exploring the origins of territorial policies during Ben Franklin's era would help illuminate how U.S. government officials negotiate with American Indians, answer questions about whether slavery would expand beyond the southern states, and how these policies affected the actions of presidential administrations through the 19th century. I believe that discussing the effect of this act is a topic that will be thought-provoking to the audience of Ben Franklin's World.
Hi, I'm Serena Zabin, the Stephen R. Lewis Jr. Professor of History and the Liberal Arts at Carleton College, and I'm thrilled to have the chance to talk about Ben Franklin's world. To me, Ben Franklin's world is the whole messy, uncertain, and exciting world of the 18th century. This podcast does such a wonderful job of introducing its listeners to lots of important elements of the 18th century, and especially to the founding of the United States. But if I had to choose just one thing to emphasize, it is this. I would like people to understand that in Ben Franklin's world, there was no sharp line between politics and domestic life. Families and politics were intertwined worlds. Politics shaped families. They shaped who could marry, who controlled children, and who lived with their in-laws. But families also shaped politics. It's worth remembering that at some points during the American Revolution, the battlefront and the home front were the same.
Hi, I'm John Bickers. For me, Ben Franklin's world is a world of new possibilities, of interactions between various peoples, nations, and cultures that had never come together before. It was a world of endless possibilities and had the potential for so much good. But it was also a world of violence, of unkept promises, of myriads of atrocities. The decisions made in Ben Franklin's world, both intentional and unintentional, successful and unsuccessful, have shaped every aspect of our lives today. In a very real sense, we're still living in Ben Franklin's world. If I had to choose only one event, person, or place that I wish people knew about, I think it would have to be the Treaty of Fort Pitt, signed in 1778 between the United States and the Lenape, Delaware Nation. In fact, it's the first treaty signed by the United States with a Native American nation following the Declaration of Independence. And it's a fascinating document that really speaks to the complexities of the Revolutionary era in this colonial world. In exchange for supporting the revolution, it promised perpetual peace and friendship with the Lenape Nation. So much so that it even included a provision that the Lenape could join the United States as a 14th state with congressional representation. And although that provision was never implemented, again, speaking to some of the failures of this world, it also speaks to, again, this myriad of possibilities that there was a world in which there was a 14th state that was Native controlled, Native organized, Native run. And I think it's a fascinating treaty that more people need to study. And I think it sets the stage really importantly for Native and American interactions after the Revolutionary War.
Hello, this is Nicole Maskiel. When I think of Ben Franklin's world, I think of it as a place of stories, some that challenge, some that heal, all that teach us about the contours of the past. I've always been an avid listener to the Ben Franklin's World podcast, but have also discovered that teaching alongside it can be a blast as well. Ben Franklin's early world, colonial Boston and its environs, was the first early American world that captivated me. The gravestone of an enslaved girl named Cicely, who was a contemporary of Ben Franklin, likely only 8 years older than Ben, was the spark that led me to pursue a career in early American history. Her gravestone was part of the landscape of my everyday walk from Harvard Yard to Soho House, just as the Franklin family vault was visible every Sunday that I sat in Park Street Church. But their lives and deaths were contrasts as well. She lived a short life of unfree labor, 15 years old at her death, with a grave marker of the only testimony to her existence. While Ben's life spanned 8 decades and was one filled with exploits that have shaped the histories told about our nation. Cicely and Ben's stories intersected, but they also diverge in important ways along lines of race, gender, and class, lines that still divide and continue to challenge. It's these myriad unnoticed people who inhabited the haunts that also surrounded Franklin, who shaped them in important ways, and whose experiences force us to reevaluate the worlds we thought we knew, that continues to pull me back into the place that we know as Ben Franklin's world.
Hi, I'm Joe Edelman. As a historian who's written about Franklin, the meaning of Ben Franklin's world for me starts with the man himself. He's a great avatar of the 18th century. It seems like he tried everything. Trained as a printer, Franklin saw networks and connections as central to his life. When he couldn't solve a problem on his own, he tried to solve it with other people. He was curious about the world around him. He explored that world, from traveling the length of the Atlantic coast in North America to the time he lived in England and France. He was by no means perfect, particularly with regard to practicing slavery and his views on gender. Like him, we too should be curious about the world of early America. How did people communicate and move around? What was life like for people from the most ordinary, which is how Franklin started his life, to the most famous, which is how he ended it? And there are few better ways to honor the spirit of discovery and connection than a podcast that explores early America through conversation and community. That's why I think the person you should know more about is Mary Catherine Goddard. If you've heard of her, it's probably as the woman who printed the first version of the Declaration of Independence that had all the signers' names on it. But she's so much more. Women in early America were active throughout economic life. And as Goddard's life shows, not every woman lived out her life's work through marriage and children. After she helped her brother, the printer William Goddard, at his offices in Providence and Philadelphia, she became proprietor of her own print shop in Baltimore. There she published the Maryland Journal and served as the town's first postmistress in the Continental Post Office. Like Franklin, she too was a slaveholder. But through her life and her work in publishing, we can learn more about the complexities and contradictions that made up Ben Franklin's world. Congrats, Liz, on 400 episodes.
Thank you, Joe, and thank you so much for being part of the long 10-year history of Ben Franklin's world. Now, Joe took us into the world of printing. As he mentioned, it's quite natural for a scholar of print media in the 18th century to think of Ben Franklin in Ben Franklin's world. This thought also occurred to another guest scholar, Marcia Beliciano, founding director of the Benjamin Franklin House in London.
What does Ben Franklin's world mean to me, and how do I define it? The late author Jim Strodes called Benjamin Franklin the essential founder. I like that designation because he played such a pivotal role in the creation of the American project, and of course was the only founder to sign all 4 documents that created the United States. I think of him as providing the light in the Enlightenment, where his contributions marked the 18th century as the age of reason. But his world, for me, also means his impact on contemporary society. We take for granted how he influences our lives today, from lightning rods and borrowing libraries to paper currency, perfection of bifocals, and the terms battery and positive and negative charges, the checks and balances of the Constitution, and a republic if we can keep it. And what historical event, person, or place do I wish more people knew about in the era of Benjamin Franklin? Well, that could only be for me as founding director of Benjamin Franklin House. It's a workaday Georgian terrace house, its builders perhaps never imagining it would stand for nearly 300 years, and Franklin's only surviving residence anywhere in the world. It's the largest extant artifact related to Franklin and holds England's highest Grade 1 heritage rating. Shortly after arriving on Craven Street, and his full tenure would last nearly 16 years, working to find a way through negotiation between the interests of the Crown and her colonies, planting the seeds of the special relationship between the US and the UK, Franklin wrote something I love to his sister. Faith, he said, is the ground floor. Hope is up one pair of stairs. Don't delight so much to dwell in lower rooms, but get as fast as you can to the top, for in truth the best room in the house is charity. His humor ever shines through. For my part, he continued, I wish the house were turned upside down. 'Tis so difficult when one is fat to get upstairs. And not only so, but I imagine hope and faith may be more firmly built on charity than charity upon faith and hope. However that may be, I think it a better reading to say, raise faith and hope one story higher. It's this abiding faith in what we can do with determination as a small independent organization, which has led to some significant results with the help of an exceptional team at the house and dedicated volunteers since opening on Franklin's 300th birthday in 2006.
Mary Beth Norton, retired from Cornell University. My most recent book is 1774, The Long Year of Revolution, published by Alfred Knopf in 2020 and available in vintage paperback. To me, Ben Franklin's world is defined spatially and intellectually. It's the Euro-American Atlantic in the 18th century, with special focus on Boston, where he was born and lived as a youth, Philadelphia, where he achieved success in business and science, and London, where he lived for years, with an addendum in Paris. His autobiography acknowledged the influence on him of Addison and Steele's Spectator essays, a key indicator to me of the Anglo-American Atlantic nature of his world. The person in Franklin's world I wish more people knew about is Judith Sargent Murray, a resident of Gloucester, Massachusetts, during and after the Revolution. She was a counterpart of Mary Wollstonecraft, truly the first American feminist. She advocated for improved women's education and wrote an essay titled On the Equality of the Sexes in the 1770s. Sheila Skemp has written 2 biographical studies of her, one including a selection of her writings, and both of which I recommend.
I am Marcus Nebius, Associate Professor of History, jointly appointed to the faculties of the Kinder Institute on Constitutional Democracy and the Department of History at the University of Missouri. I am the author of City of Refuge, Slavery and Petite Marinage in the Great Dismal Swamp, 1763 to 1856, published by the University of Georgia Press in 2020. What is the meaning of Ben Franklin's world to me? It reflects a history of momentous change in the 18th century Atlantic world. Put plainly, we often speak of revolution, of an age of revolutions. Ben Franklin's world was exactly that, an age of significant change. Having written about an obscure swamp which straddles the border of Virginia and North Carolina at perhaps the twilight of Ben Franklin's life and well into the 19th century, I've turned my attention to perhaps the most important colony in the British Atlantic world in the 18th century, Jamaica. I've done so in part because I wrote about the Great Dismal Swamp with the question of marinage top of mind. And in the story that I rendered in City of Refuge, I learned quite a bit about the way in which enslaved people's resistance and enslaved people's daily lives within slavery characterized the Great Dismal Swamp and the efforts of the many who stood up land and canal companies to extract the swamp's various natural resources. I'm presently interested in Jamaica because it allows for me to turn my attention to the subject of marinage more broadly in key ways. I'm quite interested in the way in which we can go beyond the slavery resistance binary in some ways by featuring Maroons and Marronage in the history of the British Atlantic world. I'm particularly interested in that world's contests for power and political legitimacy and cultural preservation. It's these histories that I'm currently studying as I prepare my latest book manuscript. Hopefully, I'll be able to accomplish that within the next several years, but it certainly allows for me to bring new attention, perhaps, to Ben Franklin's world.
This is Kathleen Duvall answering the second question. I wish more people knew about Priscilla Mason. Priscilla Mason was a student at the Young Ladies Academy of Philadelphia after the Revolution. She graduated in May of 1793, and she gave a graduation speech in which she accused men of holding women back. She said, "Our high and mighty lords have denied us the means of knowledge and then reproached us for the want of it. Being the stronger party, they early seized the scepter and the sword. With these, they gave laws to society. They denied women the advantage of a liberal education and doomed the sex to servile or frivolous employments on purpose to degrade their minds, that they themselves might hold unrivaled the power and preeminence they had usurped." Now, Priscilla Mason was hopeful. She thought things were changing in 1793. But we really don't know anything about Priscilla Mason except for this speech. And that really shows that things weren't changing all that much for young women. They weren't changing enough that she could go on to fulfill her ambitions and enter the professions.
Karen Wolf, John Carter Brown Library and Brown University. It's such a delight to think about Ben Franklin's world for this 400th episode. And first of all, I have to say congratulations, Liz. It's quite an achievement to make it to this milestone. Ben Franklin's world was such a complex place. And I think what it means to me is that we acknowledge that complexity. Franklin himself may seem the ultimate man of rationality, a scientist, a printer, a diplomat, a politician, someone who made his way through the world with purpose. But the world that he was making his way through was so complicated, and he acknowledged that complication, that complexity. He understood its diversity and the challenges inherent in living in a world that's diverse, in which people are trying to make the best of sometimes very difficult situations. I think what Ben Franklin's World, the podcast, does best is really convey that complexity. When I look at the last episodes, even just this year, you think about Nikki Eustace talking about Indigenous justice, and you think about Jonathan Ganaf talking about the Constitution and interpretations thereof. It's an incredible array that really represents the fullness of the world that Ben Franklin himself lived in and observed.
Thank you, Karen. And I'm really glad that you've been a part of this incredible journey that is podcasting about early America. So thank you so much for your support and your help over the years. Now, as you've heard, most scholars who study early America define Ben Franklin's world, that world that Ben Franklin actually lived in, as the world of the 18th century British Atlantic. And they aren't wrong. This is the world that Benjamin Franklin actually lived in and he interacted with. However, my graduate advisor, Alan Taylor, and my California professors and classmates would never forgive me if I left out the even larger worlds that British North America and Benjamin Franklin were a part of. And those are the wider worlds of Indigenous and Spanish North America. And our last guest historian studies these worlds, and he offers a very thoughtful and different point of view from our other guests.
My name is Esteban Rael Galvez, and I'm the executive director of Native Bound Unbound, where we are creating a digital archive and repository centered on the lives of the enslaved Indigenous people across the Americas. Ben Franklin looms large in the national narrative and consciousness. To quote from the musical of another founding father, Franklin was often in the room where it happened, meaning he was at the forefront of so many of the key events that would define the foundations of what would become the United States of America. He was there drafting the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Treaty of Paris. No wonder he was not just the $10 founding father, but the $100 founding father. It's hard not to think of that man who counted among his favorite books, Plutarch's Lives, which was based on a key premise that individual endeavor can change the course of history for the better. The image I have, however, of Franklin, and when I think of the world that he created, is of a man driven by curiosity, inventive, entrepreneurial, and an unshakable moral compass, at least publicly. Though I'm not in any way a historian of Benjamin Franklin or early colonial U.S., yet I can imagine that he was not every bit as flawed as other men made of flesh and bone. But of all the founding fathers, there is something about him that is just so core to the values that underpin and define the United States. When I think of that image of Franklin, though, I actually see reflections of him in some of the old men and women I grew up with in the villages of northern New Mexico, including my dad, who loved to read and still does at 97, who values education more than anything, who I witnessed inventing out of necessity, who always absorbs the achievements of those around him, who raises leading questions rather than argue, subtly navigating others towards solutions. Even Franklin's calculated diplomacy of what seems endemic to a farmer, who looks to the sky and to the ground, to the seasons, and thinks always of possibilities in the face of changes. When I think of the places I wish more people knew about, of course, I think of where I sit today in Santa Fe, New Mexico, known in Franklin's era as the northern part of New Spain, contemporary Mexico, a place that would be taken in a war of aggression against Mexico less than 60 years after Franklin's death, a place that is older than Boston and Philadelphia or any of the 13 colonies. Interesting to think that even though places like Santa Fe and Taos were centuries older, Albuquerque was settled the same year that Franklin was born in 1706. Of course, I also think of all of the indigenous lands and communities that existed in that era throughout what would become the United States, sovereign settings of communities fighting the expansion of the U.S. that was already set in motion in that era. When I think of contemporaneous events to Franklin, those I wish others would know about, I think of the Dominguez Escalante expedition of 1776, taken to find an overland route from Santa Fe, New Mexico to Monterey, California. I think of the monumental changes indigenous communities endured during the 18th century, many living at the violent edges of U.S. empire. I think of the 7 Years' War and of Franklin's political cartoon, Join or Die. I want people to know more about the Iroquois and the Wabanaki confederacies, both influential in the war on the British and the French, respectively. I think of the role that indigenous people and Hispanic people from places like Florida and New Mexico had on the American Revolution. When I think of Franklin's contemporaries, those I wish more people would know about, I think of those known here in New Mexico like Bernardo Miera y Pacheco, whose life almost completely overlapped that of Franklin's. Miera y Pacheco was born in 1713 and died in 1785. He was an artist, sombrero, one of the most prolific cartographers of the time, and like Franklin, proficient across a wide variety of disciplines. Of all the governors of New Mexico, certainly there are interesting people like Juan Bautista de Anza, significant to the entire region, including California, but I think most of Tomás Bayes de Cachupín, serving in that role in the mid-18th century, recognized for warring and brokering peace with the Comanches in particular, but also strategically leading resettlement efforts of landless, former enslaved indigenous people into communities like that of Abiquiu, which would have a lasting impact upon the social landscape. I think of people like Rosa Villalpando, who was captured by the Comanches in 1760 in Taos, traded to the Pawnee, and then ended up living in St. Louis, Missouri.
I could name more figures known here, but my whole life I've been drawn to tell the stories of the marginalized, those people whose lives never made it into history books, who are obscured or erased in the archive. Here, while some of these lives emerge whole, most surface in mere fragments, a record in a captive raid, a bill of sale noted among the produce and hooved animals, the peripheral subject of a trial proceeding, though more often relegated as an object or chattel in a dispute between men, records written by clerics recording baptisms, deaths, and marriages, names and cash shifting based on the whims of men with quills. Among these, I think of my mother's last known matrilineal ancestor, 9 generations, tracing each mother to a daughter, down to me, a son, connecting me to Antonia, who first appeared in the 1750 census here in Santa Fe, identified simply with the term India.
You'll find more information about all of our guests, their past Ben Franklin's World episodes, their books, historic sites, plus notes, links, and a transcript for everything we talked about today on the show notes page. benfranklinsworld.com/400. This is episode 400, which means I've been reflecting a lot on the last 10 years and 400 episodes of this show. And although I think about this quite often, I would like to take a moment to thank the Omohundro Institute and our current sponsor, the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, for all of their support over the years. They have seen the value in this work, and they have paid to not only keep the show going with all the apps and hosting fees and things that go on the production side of the show, but they've also paid me to produce Ben Franklin's World. So thank you very much for your support, and please check out the Omohundro Institute and the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, both of which are 501c3 nonprofit organizations. Now, if you enjoyed this episode, please tell your friends. Friends tell friends about their favorite podcasts, so be sure you tell them about Ben Franklin's World. Production assistance for this podcast comes from Morgan McCullough. Breakmaster Cylinder composed our custom theme music. This podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network. To discover and listen to their other podcasts, visit airwavemedia.com. Finally, happy holidays! I have one more new episode for you before the end of the year, so be sure to keep an eye out for episode 401, which will be all about the tea crisis of 1773. Ben Franklin's World is a production of Colonial Williamsburg Innovation Studios.